Hello everyone. Today I'm going to be taking you through the process I went through to create this optimized asset from a Polycam capture. This tutorial is not intended as a step-by-step, but as an overview of the process and sequence of stages involved from taking a photo scan to a game-ready asset. My wish is that this can help guide someone with their own particular capture. There can be a lot of reasons why you may want to take these steps with your capture or one that you find on Polycam. Maybe it's a large drone capture building that you want to use as a prop in an animation you're working on. But by the time you get all the other assets in the scene, your computer is gasping for air. Maybe you would like to animate the asset itself, and you need to separate pieces into different objects, some that might be animated. But it's really hard to get a clean edge with booleans and knife tools. Maybe your idea is to brainstorm different colorways or material combinations for your project, and it would be easier to have a more organized UV layout and image texture to work with. It's helpful to keep in mind how much of a head start you actually get by beginning from a photo scan than if you were to start from scratch, and just how many models there are available on the Polycam Explore page. For this example, I'm going to work on creating a new asset out of this car capture. Okay, here we are in Blender. I'm going to go ahead and delete the camera and the light and import my capture. I'm going to start with the cube. Cubes are often the best place to start, but it does depend on what model you're wanting to retopologize. The cube provides a good starting point because of its size and its orientation to the X, Y, and Z axis, which will help us in the modeling process when we move vertices. Now pressing Command R, I'm going to cut a loop in this cube, and then I will delete half of this cube because I will be adding a mirror modifier. Delete this bottom face because there's not much texture to really draw from, and it will make the modeling easier. With the cube selected, I'm going to add in a mirror modifier and turn on clipping. Okay, now I'll be moving up the front and the back faces to fully close in this car. Now I'm going to switch to solid shading and turn the color mode to texture. With these settings, you can be in X-ray mode and still be able to reference the texture. From there, I'm going to start using the loop cut tool. And the loop cut tool creates a new edge down the middle of a row of quads. In this way, we will progressively subdivide the cube one row of faces at a time. I'm going to add these loop cuts where I see the surface angle changing on the car. It's best to start with 3 or maybe 4 at a time, and then move those vertices, and then do another set of loop cuts. At this point, the modeling process becomes highly particular to the capture that you are trying to work with. So for that reason, I'm going to speed up the playback a little bit so you can just see sliding vertices, pressing G twice. And then moving vertices to conform to the different topology of the car. And then I change my angle of view and move it again. And then it's a back and forth process of moving vertices, sliding vertices, and cutting new vertices, all while orbiting the mesh. So it's good to get very quick with the viewport controls. With these polygons in the front here, we don't want them that scrunched together, so what you want to do is just slide these edges up and more towards the center of the hood. For now, I'm not going to worry about the bumper. Because it's a chrome bumper, there's not much use in trying to bake that. It would be easier to just have a PBR material. I'm going to switch over to the sculpting mode, and using the smooth brush on a very low strength setting, it'll help me relax some of these polygons and get them in a more equal size to each other. Okay, as far as the car body is concerned, it's looking pretty good now. About ready to UV unwrap it. Yeah, it looks pretty good. Applying the mirror modifier. Oh, I'm noticing now that this back edge could be beveled, so I'm selecting that real quick and beveling it out. Okay, now moving on, I will be creating my seams for the UV unwrap. To start the UV unwrapping process, you're going to want to be in edge mode and select and then press Shift Control to progressively select a path and create your UV island. I'm going to go down this side of the corner here and then right click and press Mark Seam. If I had not already applied the mirror modifier, I could have applied it after I marked the seams on only one side, and then I would be given the seams on the other side as well too. But that's okay. Mark seam. And I will do the same around the back side. And Shift Control, select, mark seam. And then I'm going to select all the faces, right click, press unwrap. This is looking really nice. I'm going to unwrap it again because the first time I forgot to add an island margin, and I want to be sure to have that. And now in the remaining space of the texture map, we're going to add our tire geometry. But first we need to model it. So I'll press Shift A to add a cylinder. Then I will change the vertices to 8, set the radius, set the depth, the rotation, set the location, roughly. Then if I tab into edit mode, I can keep the origin at the 0x axis and move it over. This will be helpful later when we use the mirror modifier. Now because I've had 8 vertices selected when created this primitive, I can simply inset faces, pressing I, and then inset faces one more time. And then with those vertices selected, I can press M to merge them at center. Then I will select every other edge, press X, and dissolve edges, and that leaves you with all quads in the middle. And you want quads because you want to eventually subdivide this tire. You want to make it easy enough to model, and then at the very end you can just apply that subdivision modifier and have better geometry. So I'm insetting faces and extruding faces and then scaling those to roughly match up with this tire. Quickly here, you'll see me add a subdivision modifier just to check and make sure everything is being subdivided evenly. And now I'm selecting more edge loops and then marking those seams so I can get a good unwrap of this tire. Control A to select everything and then hit unwrap. With the islands looking good, I'm going to tab out of edit mode, select both objects and hit Control J. And then selecting islands in the UV map, I am doing a little bit of work just trying to maximize pixels that I will get per UV island. Okay, now we're going to start the baking process. So what I want to do is create a material for my low poly mesh, and then I want to add in an image texture node. Shift A to add a new node. Go to Texture, Image Texture. We're going to create a new texture here. I'm going to name it Car Bake Color. And set the size of the resolution that you want. You don't need to have alpha. You also do not need to change the color. I was doing a little bit of experimentation here. So then I'm going to press Command C to copy that image node. And then in my high poly mesh, I'm going to paste that unconnected. And we're going to be baking from the emission shader, so we need to change this to emission. And then pressing Control T, you will be connecting that image texture to a mapping and a texture coordinate node, which sometimes Blender needs to be able to visualize the textures that you have. Okay, double checking that both of my objects have the same highlighted image texture node selected. I'm going to go to my render settings and change the render type to cycles. Then I will turn the render samples down to 1, scroll down to bake, change the bake type to emit, turn on selected to active, and now we need to set an extrusion level for this bake to happen with. So if you go to Mesh, and if you're in Edit mode and you go to Image Overlays, you can turn on normal tangents, and that'll give you an approximate size for a ray distance or extrusion that you can set in the Bake Settings tab. You want to set that as low as you can just to keep artifacts from appearing. And it looks like 0.08 is a good place to try. There may be some areas here where I need to push these vertices back in order to get a closer relationship between the high and the low poly mesh. So I'm just moving these a little bit back on the y-axis. Okay, that's looking close enough. So now, to start the baking process, what I like to do is prepare my viewport so I can see my image texture that I'm baking to. And what I want to do is make sure that both image nodes are highlighted with white, and then I'm going to shift click the high mesh and then shift click the low mesh. So the lower poly mesh is in yellow and the higher poly mesh is in red. Set my extrusion to 0.08 and hit bake. Oh, it came out rather nicely. It helps to have a good estimation for your extrusion level. Otherwise, you're going to be guessing and checking until you get it right. For example, this is what happens when the extrusion level is set too low. You will have these black holes in your texture image. Going back to the good version, I'm going to save my image. After saving, let's pop over to the texture paint panel and set our shading settings to flat and textured shading. The primary tool of choice here is going to be the clone brush tool. And that's just going to be sampling textures from another part of the model into where you're wanting to paint. Press Command and right click to choose where you're going to sample from, and you'll see the 3D cursor goes to that point. Then I like to use a reference line on the texture to find where I'm going to apply the clone stamping tool. And continue painting out the rest of this shadow. And the seam of this door. You can also use it at an angle So I'm just gonna paint over the whole rear view mirror. And then I'm gonna just scan around and check for any large areas that would be easy to clone brush out. I'm also gonna be editing a little bit in Photoshop, and so I can continue some more work in there. With Photoshop's clone brushing tool, it's a little bit better because it gives you a preview of where you're about to mark. This can be helpful also if you make some loop cuts after you've already baked your texture. You can still slide those and they will not stretch your texture. Here I'm using the blur brush tool to push back some of these artifacts that are the results of the capture process. Later on in Photoshop, I'm just going to give these another blur, but it can be helpful to do it here in Blender as well. A little bit more of the clone brush stamping on this tire, but most of the work of this is going to be done in Photoshop. Okay, we're going to move to Photoshop, so I need to save my image before I do anything else. Okay, now we're in Photoshop, and this is the spot removing tool. The healing brush tool is basically a clone stamping tool from Blender, but it's a little bit better. I'm just fixing up some areas of the trim, and here I'm going to be selecting all the windows because I want to create a black and white texture mask. I can use that for opacity, and then I can also use that plus a couple other nodes to set roughness values. Just using the lasso tool and the polygonal lasso tool and the magnetic lasso tool. Creating a new layer and the paint bucket tool to create a black and white texture mask. Give that a name. While it's still selected, I'm going to blur these windows a little bit more. That looks good. Here in the tire, we only have a really small section of this tread, so sometimes that's the case. You just have to work with it. What I'm going to do is just copy and paste that tread around the perimeter, and then I'll use the healing brush tool to try to blend all those layers together. Sometimes this is just what it takes. You have to make a little go a long ways. But in areas where you're not going to really notice the detail, this is totally acceptable. I'm going to reorder these layers. And then, yes, using the healing brush tool. Oh, first you have to merge the layers. Now I'm going to just take care of some of the seams. You still have a little bit of a alternating cool and warm colors in this tire, but it's really not going to be that noticeable if you're relighting this capture. I missed a little spot here, so I'm going to duplicate this area one more time. Match it up, and then just use the clone brushing tool to fix the rest. Another common artifact that you'll probably run into with cars or other metal surfaces is this glare. In most 3D work, when you talk about seams, you're trying to get rid of them, and here in this particular case, we're trying to bring this seam back. It's right there in between the windshield wipers and the air vents of the hood. But because the windshield wipers also could have their shadow removed, I figure why not. Here I'm just knocking down some of this glare. This is the shadows and highlights adjustments. And what you can do is you can bring up the shadows a little bit and bring down the highlights. But if you push these levels too hard, they will be starting to look weird. Okay, exporting those PNGs. Exporting the opacity layer. And now back in Blender, I have the new color texture hooked up, and I'm bringing in my opacity texture. And basically, yeah, all the hard work is done now. It's just a matter of adjusting a couple things here and there. You may catch a glimpse here of some sorting issues, and that happens when you have two alphas and a back face looking through, and it's just confusing Eevee. But in Cycles is totally cool, so that's what we will be using. Here I'm adding a subdivision modifier to the whole thing and seeing how it looks. The subdivision modifier is causing a little bit of a texture error right there on the windshield, so I'm going to separate out the wheels, which is where I really want to subdivide it. And I'll just keep the lower poly version of the car, because it looks fine. There's the transparency sorting issues in the Eevee render. I've added a light. Here I'm going to use this opacity mask also to adjust some of the roughness values. And I've found the easiest way to do this is by adding a RGB curves node. And then you can bring up both edges up and down to adjust the lightness and the darkness of that. You could also use a color ramp node as well. I would really encourage you to try this process. It helps so much all of your 3D skills. It really helps your modeling improve. You don't need to look at two different images from the orthographic views. You have your sample model right there. And depending on what your goals are, I feel like the quicker you get your assets created, the further you can take them in animation or in game development. And really it can just springboard you into so many different other skills. And to wrap it up here, I just want to show these two other assets that I worked on in preparation for this tutorial. Thank you everyone for watching.